Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Stu Schulman, and we're going to talk about all things to do with Twitter and future directions and some of the implications of things we're seeing. But before we get started, if you're new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing. We're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting research, writing about it, sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a student or brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And I know that I have a lot to learn about the topic that we are going to discuss here today. Why don't you begin by just introducing yourself, Stu?
Sure, thanks. That's, Janet, really nice diagram. It kind of speaks to a lot of my own experiences as an academic, working on teaching and learning, looking for tools that made teaching and learning better, thinking the internet was a place to do that. So my training is I'm a political science PhD from the University of Oregon, a political historian. I wrote about the Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916. Unlikely user of software, to say the least, because a lot of my work was pen and paper and archival and would be very familiar to any historian, but less familiar to political scientists maybe these days. After grad school, I started teaching and became interested in public comments on a proposed regulation about organic agriculture. The year was 2000. And they were taking comments online. And I had been an organic farmer earlier in my life, certified organic farmer in Eugene, Oregon, and I was curious about these comments. And I contacted the USDA, and they sent me a zip disk with 20,000 public comments on them.
Wow.
And that was the year 2000. And I contacted a program officer on the advice of my father, a social work professor. And he said, you should contact the NSF and see if there's any funding to study the data. And I got in touch with a gentleman, Larry Brandt at the NSF, and he, about 30 days later, awarded me a $30,000 exploratory grant to join the digital government research program at the NSF. And I met the most wonderful computer scientists from across that field, but we were also charged with going out and meeting members of government agencies, so people who are doing the work of government, and diverse social scientists who wanted to do work on the emerging internet and the possibility for digital government. That's how I got into using software, mostly qualitative software, because that was my background. So programs like NVivo or Nudist or Atlas TI or MaxQDA, these were all programs that I had used. And I developed a lab at the University of Pittsburgh called the Qualitative Data Analysis Program. The lab was sponsored by Atlas TI, and we developed software for looking at groups of annotators' work and comparing it. So as you know, in qualitative research, if you ask two or more people to do the same thing, they'll probably do it in a different way. And in computer science, this causes a lot of problems because machine learning is predicated on the idea that people will look at something and see it the same way. And so this series of events led me to be a user of software and somebody who was reaching out to the qualitative research community, especially the Atlas TI listserv at the time, and trying to get help building the pieces that we needed for our scientific studies. And when we found out that the qualitative research community didn't really want to build those pieces that were traditional qualitative pieces, focusing on human observation and measurement, we decided to build them ourselves. One of the great things about getting NSF grants is you get a little bit of the money back and you can spend it on things like hiring a programmer. So I hired a programmer in 2007 and we started building software, and we've been working together ever since. And if it were not for this one person and that little project, everything I've done in software would never have happened.
Right. Well, it's kind of a segue to thinking about Twitter, to begin thinking kind of writ large. I mean, what I like about Twitter and how I use it with the work I'm doing with MethodSpace is finding, not necessarily collecting data. I'm not doing research on Twitter. I'm
Sure.
looking for community across disciplines, across the globe, with people who are doing innovative work. They may not be celebrity professors that other people have heard of. They may be just starting out, but they're doing something really innovative. And, then, inviting them to contribute to MethodSpace. So their work gets out to a larger audience, and we can learn from each other. And, that kind of just accidental, coincidental encounters that can become, long-term collegial relationships and collaborations and all sorts of things. So, those characteristics to me are kind of unique to Twitter. I have not really found those on, the other social media sites, but, as you brought out in the post you made that to the Association of Internet Researchers list, that where I met you, highlighted directions that have been going for some time with Twitter that are not so kind and friendly as what I'm describing. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about what you've been seeing, and some of the trends around hate speech and weaponization as you
Sure.
described it.
Well, first of all, I want to agree with and second your point and avoid being pigeonholed here as doomsayer. I also like Twitter for all the reasons you said, especially like the fact that you highlight that you can accidentally discover communities or people or ideas or things that become important to you without looking for them. That actually maps really well to an inductive qualitative research method,
Mhm.
right? Where you don't go in with an agenda, you go into the data, and things happen
Right.
and foment. So I would like to, before I say anything bad about Twitter,
Hmm.
say that I also love Twitter. It's definitely a love-hate relationship. And some of the same things that you're describing are also, unfortunately, things that make it possible for the weaponization to take place. They're the same mechanism in a way.
Mhm.
It's being leveraged. And so my story with discovering accidentally what was going on Twitter started really in 2019. I'd been doing Twitter research for a long time. We were customer number 9 back in 2011 of a company called GNIP that Twitter eventually bought for $140 million. And so we were using the premium Twitter data before most
Mhm.
academics or even corporations were using it to do academic research around smoking back then. And that's how we got our foot in the door and got to know everybody and got to know the data landscape as well. And so we had done quite a bit of work, including participating in these annual meetings of the Big Boulder Initiative and helping to form a 501c6, a nonprofit dedicated to the long-term preservation of the social data industry. So again, these were all positive intention, great opportunity, wonderful moment in history. By 2019, it became clear that there was something else going on Twitter that was sort of the opposite of the democratic participatory potential that we originally sort of looked for in the internet. And it was at that opposite end of the spectrum where people were weaponizing it. The way I found it was quite accidental. I had heard that in the Canadian election, I grew up in Canada, that there was an attack underway and that Trudeau was being attacked on Twitter, and that a particular hashtag, Trudeau must go, was very active in the election. I started collecting data on that and all of the 4 major candidates in the Canadian election in the fall of 2019. And looking at the data, I started seeing things that I really had never seen before and I didn't understand. For example, I saw a lot of Americans talking about Canadian politics And this was very unexpected. I have a
Mhm.
PhD in American politics. I grew up in Canada. I follow the politics of both countries. And
Mhm.
I can say with certainty, Americans don't really talk about Canadian politics.
Right.
It's not something they do. So this was unexpected and kind of raised my, and then I started looking more closely. Who are these Americans? How do they describe themselves? And it turns out that a lot of them were describing themselves as MAGA or Trump or QAnon, or they had the "Where we go one, we go all" WWG, whatever that is,
Mhm.
in their bios. So I became very focused on the use of the Twitter user description as the metadata field, but it's your bio, it's how you describe yourself on
Mhm.
Twitter. And what we found were a whole bunch of really strange things going on in the Canadian election, things that didn't make any sense. Not just that Americans seem to know a lot about Canadian politics, which was a stretch, but there were thousands of accounts that were professing to be Americans that occasionally tweeted in Russian or frequently shared Russian propaganda sites like South Front or others. And so we started getting a little suspicious that there was some election interference. Digging deeper, we got into a community of researchers and people who were all sort of aware of the fact that there was a concerted strategy to create fake accounts on Twitter. And we developed a model for identifying the footprint of bots and trolls. It's now called the Trust Defender. It's a free open source set of software that anybody can use to score an account on the likelihood it's doing something odd. And by odd, we mean things like tweeting 100 to 1,500 times per day. That, is a fairly easy thing to spot.
Mhm.
Leaves a quite distinctive digital footprint. And even as an outsider with only limited access to a small part of the data, we were able to see that there were a bunch of really strange accounts, hyperactive accounts. Some of them turned out to be humans. Some of them turned out to be bots, but that was how I got drawn into it, and it became, it sort of coincided um, with the lead up to the 2020 primaries. So I had developed a set of ideas.
Mhm.
I'd spoken to some news media outlets, CTV, CBC. They had taken quotes from me and other researchers, and then taken quotes from Twitter. And basically, the researchers would say there's something going on here. And the Twitter would say there's nothing going on. These people don't have the real data. We have the real data. If they only knew how much we knew, they would know there's nothing going on here, which I always thought was very strange.
Mhm.
That we were being sort of publicly told that we were wrong, even though we were looking at the data. It was clearly something
Mhm.
was not right. For example, in the Canadian election, I have a slide on it somewhere. If you looked at the accounts that tweeted more than 100 times a day in my data set, 90% of them had one of 7 Trump QAnon buzzwords in the user bio. 90%. So, I mean, this is
Right.
clearly an orchestrated strategy. And then I use that information starting in late December, right around Christmas, to start collecting data about Biden because I knew the primaries were coming up.
Mhm.
And I had seen Biden speak. I live close to New Hampshire. I'd been to see him speak. I was interested in him as a candidate. And so I started collecting millions of tweets. And if you look at that data, you can see a huge viral footprint of one particular Twitter user named Charlie Kirk. Maybe you've come across Charlie Kirk. He
Mhm.
is basically one of Trump's agent provocateurs on
Mhm.
Twitter, but all of the most viral tweets, or many of the most viral tweets about Biden over a week long period from December 22nd to the 29th or 30th were mostly Charlie Kirk tweets, and they were all attack tweets, and there hadn't been a vote cast yet in the primaries or in New Hampshire or Iowa, and it was clear that Biden was in the target, and that this QAnon online movement was attacking Biden more than anybody else before anybody had voted the Democratic primaries. So for me, this set off a bunch of red flags. I started telling people and making videos about it, asking people if they knew what was going on. And then things got really interesting. I'll stop because at this point things did get very interesting because it was January and I got contacted by a professor who used my software, whose students, some of whom are in the intelligence community. And the next thing I knew, I got invited to give a presentation to something called the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, which meant I was briefing the staff of the Joint Chiefs, Joint Strategic Operations Command, the intelligence divisions of the entire US and UK military establishment on February 12th, 2020, about QAnon.
Mm-hmm.
February 9th, 2020 was the first day it was on the cover of the New York Times. So I had that slide in my deck, and it was clear that people were just starting to realize the thing that I had found in the Canadian election: digital soldiers, people who were strangely loyal to Russia and to authoritarianism, to Trump, and who use their Twitter bios and those techniques that I've just sort of started to write about and make videos about, the Twitter trains and the other, we tag 30 people. These were the weapons of mass persuasion, right? That were cult building. I actually come to recognize, once I read the book, The Cult of Trump, and got to know Stephen Hassan, the author of that book, that what we were talking about was actually a cult of personality, the cult of Trump, and the behavior of these people online, some of whom were real, some of whom were fake. I think the genius of the scheme was that it empowered people in something we describe as an alternate reality game, where they take on a persona, maybe a fake picture, fake identity. They can say anything they want. Twitter was already a bastion of all sorts of bizarre types of free speech that push the boundaries of what's acceptable. And they would play this game, and the game works this way. If you put something controversial on it, you get 10 retweets, you feel great. If you get 100, you feel fantastic. If you get 1,000, you're an influencer. Suddenly you start getting followers. We started finding all these strange accounts. I've documented a bunch of them around Steve Bannon and Bannonism and Getter. These very strange accounts where they have 10-to-1, 20-to-1 ratio followers to following. And that's very hard to do unless you're a public figure. And these are not public figures.
Right.
They figured out ways to weaponize and gamify the system. A bunch of these people doing this stuff on Twitter about Getter, I mean, they're openly calling for murdering people who promote vaccines.
Right.
And this stuff is all live on Twitter. It's clearly violates all the Twitter terms of service. I've reported many of these accounts. This is one of the things that's come up in the last few days on Twitter. People describing, hey, trust and safety team, we're glad that you weren't fired yet by Elon Musk, but here are examples of all the things we've been reporting. And I'd say less than 3, maybe less than 2% of everything I report that's a clear violation actually results in a suspension. The things you do get notified when you report and an account is suspended, you get a notification and it tells you. So I know that a lot of the really heinous, weaponized, dangerous accounts breaking the Twitter terms of service that I reported are not suspended. Also, ones that were previously suspended have come back on. And this has nothing to do with Elon Musk. This was just Twitter as Twitter.
Right. But as we move forward and even those ineffective restrictions are removed, what will come, it's just hard to say. And, in terms of what the implications are for academics, on one hand, you feel like, well, if the people who have been studying, people like you who've been studying these kinds of issues and trying to bring it to light, back away because it's too sensitive, there's too many threats, it gets to your personal safety, as we've seen just in the last week,
Sure,
the attack on Paul Pelosi.
of course.
I think there was in one of the things that you wrote, that I was reading, or talking about it's spilling over from the online environment into the real world. And so, if that creates an environment that's too dangerous for people to even study the questions, then what do we have? So, in terms of, just to be, overly simplistic, in terms of two angles, one being the kind of free global interdisciplinary network, which I think a lot of us really appreciated, especially with the restrictions from the pandemic, where there are fewer conferences and things like that, which even then were, much more limited in terms of, say the discipline, sorry.
Call from Van Denver.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think
So,
it's
limiting on that side, but then also, in terms of the inquiry into, how does this operate? Who's here? What are they doing? So it seems like there's kind of a lose-lose situation here.
well, a couple of things. One is Twitter deserves credit where credit is due. So they have a program for academic Twitter data access that is incredibly robust. When we started accessing as paying customer in 2011, the premium historical Twitter data, and then operating a service for 4 years where you can go in and self-serve, what they offer now for free to academics is amazing. And 10 million tweets a month. If your project is approved, that's more data than most academics need to study anything in a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a very robust program in place, and it would be a shame if one of the things that happened is academic Twitter got shut down. So there is that data collection piece. There are always other ways to get Twitter data. But I think we also have to understand that the reason so many academics study Twitter data is because of its availability and because of its format and its structure. It's easy to get data. And that's what drew the computer scientists, the computer scientists to it early on, and social scientists to it later, was that it was structured in such a way that made it amenable to capture and amenable to research. And I think so. Twitter does deserve credit where credit is due. They haven't shut that off. I've never heard Elon say he doesn't want people to have access to Twitter data. My guess is he probably wants to monetize it rather than give it away. But that remains to be seen. That would be just speculation. What I would be most worried about with the future of the platform is if it becomes easier rather than harder to do the things that didn't work, but they almost did in 2020. Meaning, when these activities were reported by myself and others to the intelligence community in February 2020, that would have worked its way up to the political level. The political level would have seen that information and said, well, we work for this guy, forget it, we're not going to do anything about this. So now we're at a slightly different point in history. We have a different president in office. The same information is out there about the weaponization of Twitter. I mean, election denial. Election denial is one of the craziest things I've ever heard of in my life. Some of the most prominent elected officials promoting election denial on and off Twitter, on and off regular media, were elected on the ballots they're saying are fraudulent.
Right.
I've never even heard that discussed in the media. I've never heard one election denier explain why their election was valid, but when Trump was on the ticket with them and didn't get as many votes as them, that there was fraud and how that would work. And the reason I would love to hear that asked and explained is because I'm an election warden. I work on primaries and elections. I know the method. You work with strangers. It's absolutely impossible to cheat on the elections. It's really not credible. So
Right.
the real thing that is disturbing to me is that while Twitter has all this tremendous potential to enable communities of like-minded people to seek reinforcement and community and support through trying times, whatever all the positive uses of Twitter are, it's also this amazing place to go and have your mind loaded with so much garbage, so much absolute trash that has no basis. And now we do have a guy running it who posted this garbage news link about Paul Pelosi. And what I worry about most is that we're days away from an election that's going to be disputed for weeks. And Twitter, for better or worse, Facebook have become the town square in which the dispute takes place. I think in certain ways they've supplanted the paper of record, the New York Times or the Post or the LA Times or even the, Wall Street Journal, other big papers. That as an aggregator and performing that aggregator function and the trending function. And I could write a list of 20 functions of Twitter that if you disabled them and wanted to protect election integrity, the election would be cleaner. The information space would be cleaner because you would disable the mechanisms that people have seen in the architecture of Twitter and said, oh, I know how to use that. I mean, the Twitter train, I think, is still the classic. This is a classic accidental discovery. In my software, you have different ways of ordering. You can order things by their time signature, so sequentially, but you can also order them by length. And I didn't know this, but when you order tweets by length, if somebody tags 30 people in a tweet, they're all going to be at the top of the list. It becomes the longest tweet. In Twitter, there are various ways to tag 30 or even as many as 50 people. So a Twitter train is when you tag 30 people, like-minded, QAnon, America First, Christian nationalists, white supremacists, they're all tagged. You share something entirely made up, provocative, or misleading. They all get a notification. And anybody on that train replies, they all get a notification. Right? And so what they did to weaponize that was they would launch the train, they would fill it with fuel, and then every once in a while they would drop 2 or 3 people and add 2 or 3 more, so that these Twitter trains had this sort of organic, evolving quality. And everybody was on the train knew that if they wrote a provocative reply, if they got attention, if they got likes or retweets, they would not only feel good, they not only be supporting their leader, their glorious leader, but they would win the game. And everybody in America, everyone around the world who loves sports, competition, or even chess or anything, knows that surge of winning. And so the genius of the weaponization of Twitter is people feel like they're winning every day. Every day they get bang for the buck of their tweet, even if it is complete garbage, designed to overthrow small d democracy and install, right-wing authoritarian government. It's a buzz. And those people on January 6th responded to a call that I reported to the intelligence community on February 12th, 2020, about digital soldiers and the storm. And I laid it all out, 65 PowerPoint slides, and the Capitol was unprepared on January 6th. And there's absolutely no reason not to have known. If you look at the Twitter data from December 18 to January 4th, there is nothing hidden about the insurrection.
Right.
It's completely planned in the open. I had been warning them since February of 2020 of what the plan was, and they did nothing.
And so now we have, even those minimal guardrails basically coming off.
There are still, bits and pieces holding, Senator Graham will have to testify for his role trying to overthrow an election.
Right.
Have to
In
tell the
terms
truth.
of within the Twitterverse and the understanding, about the kinds of things that you're talking about, that, either people are just reluctant to really accept or in denial in some way.
It's a fun
But-
game, Janet. People enjoy Twitter. They get in there, they see things they're not expecting, they click on links, they follow news stories, they're led to unexpected places to meet unexpected people. In a way, it's a fantasy world that masquerades as the front end to reality.
Mm.
And I've never said it that way before, but I think that's what it is.
Right.
It's alternate reality games existed before Twitter and Facebook. They are some of the earliest online. I learned about this from a crazy guy, actually, who was a part of it years and years and years ago. And we had all recognized that QAnon was an alternate reality game. And the goal of an alternate reality game, even before Twitter and internet or Facebook, social media platforms, was that you would do things online that would produce a real world result.
Mhm.
That was sort of the core definition. Build a community online and then have something happen in the real world. It could
Mhm.
have been goofy or trivial, not insurrectionist necessarily. But what happened in this case was the alternate reality game, I believe, was started by Roger Stone and his Russian helpers. And he posted about, months before the first QAnon, he posted a tweet that General Flynn has information on the deep state pedophiles. It's the whole QAnon narrative. But QAnon didn't exist online yet, and Roger Stone was tweeting about it months in advance. I believe Roger Stone launched the entire game with Mike Flynn. And the whole thing is a psyop, right? It's a dirty trick.
Yeah.
Russians, all they did was pour fuel on it. The Internet Research Agency just poured fuel on it. Like, great game, love this game. This fits every model we have for destroying a democracy, right? Put all this crazy stuff out about, deep state pedophiles, and the rest will write itself. And that's the genius of an alternate reality game. The story, every player in the game could be an author of a piece of the story. That's why I say it's like fantasy, because
Mhm.
everybody's empowered by Twitter to chip in and give their take on, why Hillary Clinton, eats babies, or whatever the satanic interpretation of Hillary Clinton is.
So in terms of, thinking more on the academic, scholarly students and researchers and people interested in research and networking and community building, I mean, one of the things that I've kind of been fascinated by, being old enough to remember before social media, that, what we used to call walled gardens, that there were online communities. The only people that could log in and chat are the people who are members of that community. I moderated one that was, on a platform called TechSoup, that was about technology use in
I remember
nonprofit
TechSoup.
organizations. Remember TechSoup?
I do.
And, but I mean, the only people that can be chatting are people who are a member of that group. So, I find it interesting that, say, major publications like New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, these prestigious premier publications now all have email subscription-based email lists which if you'd told me a couple of years ago, email lists are coming back, you'd be like, nah, nobody wants any more email. But they've got a lot of money and presumably market research to know that it works. Substack, Medium, all these kinds of platforms that allow for, more of a restricted space for communication seem to be, coming back. And I think that, the environment where the activity is, as you've been describing, it's just not appealing to many people who don't really want to wade through all of that. I mean, there's a whole philosophical question of how did free speech become hate speech? But in any case, people who don't want to wade through that to say, where else can we go? How else can we either get our word out, which, email list is a one direction, because you're just sending it out. Nobody's talking about it. It's just going out.
Yeah.
Or, the kinds of platforms that now, you can, set up your group and have your own place that is members only. So I just wonder what you think about some of those trends.
Well, I think of highways and car crashes, and I have to drive on the Mass Pike every now and then. And whenever there's a car crash, there's two kinds of people. There's people who just want to get around it and through it and on to the other side. And that's, half. And the other half want to slow down and really look. They want to peer deep into the car crash and know the whole detail. Well, Twitter is the car crash. Twitter is the car crash. Some people are looking for a way around that as fast as they can. But most people want to just sort of slow down and look in, and for whatever reason, I find myself guilty of this as well. Like, we want to know what's going on in there. Are people dying? For example, before the Musk takeover, I noticed a really big change in the Twitter timeline. And the way I would sum it up is like, when I would look at Twitter on my phone, the first thing I would ever see every day, every morning, was either Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, or somebody like that at the top of my thing, maybe 20% of my mobile phone screen. And then the bottom 80% of my screen was the first ad. I was like, wait, Twitter didn't used to look like this. First of all, I don't follow Marjorie Taylor Greene,
right,
or Lauren Boebert, or any of those people. So why are they showing up in my feed?
right.
So they made changes pre-Musk that were designed to create a more of a car wreck, right? Where people like me are like, why am I looking at Marjorie Taylor Greene's latest video of shooting a gun and threatening, violence? Why is that being shown to me? That's not, my bio says I coach soccer. And like democracy, and I'm a warden, why am I seeing this? And that was something that Twitter started doing because I think they know it drives engagement. It's been known forever, showing people stuff that they don't like, that they disagree. Like, for example, I've written a lot of replies that I end up deleting, and I sit there, I'm carefully wording and trying to get the maximum, and I realize, like, by the time I'm ready to post the reply, oh, I fell for it again. And I'm an expert.
Right.
But I got sucked into their vortex of hate. And that gets us back to why I think there's an unmitigated hate problem on Twitter. First of all, I have a ton of data from different periods that should definitely be deleted or suspended. And it's live. And some of it's very old. And I'm sure much of it has been reported. So there's hate thriving on Twitter long before Elon came along. I have no idea what he's going to do. There's an outside chance I'll meet him because there's a meeting coming up that I'm going to at Twitter called Chirp. And it's 2 weeks from tomorrow. And if it still goes on, I don't know if they're going to fire everybody or not. Uh-oh. We're still there, yeah. or still have meetings or not, but I imagine it's the kind of place, it's supposed to be all engineers and developers who build on the Twitter platform, where he'd be roaming around sort of whatever, carrying sinks or doing something like that.
Right.
So there's a chance I'll be face to face with the man 2 weeks tomorrow.
Well, if you learn anything new, let us know. So I hope that this is give some food for thought to our method space readers, who are people who are interested in research and interested in understanding the world, through a research lens. Through a
Let me say,
scholarly lens.
Jan, let me say one research specific thing related to Twitter that I think is
Okay.
my biggest beef, that I would feel bad if I didn't get in. Academic Twitter, which is a small office within Twitter, teaches academics to study Twitter in spreadsheets. This drives me crazy, right? They give 10 million tweets a month. You download it in the raw format, and they teach you to convert it to a spreadsheet and to study it in a spreadsheet. And I made up an argument about this on last about 7-8 minute video, but the point is, once you put it in a spreadsheet, it's not Twitter anymore. It's a derivative. There's no pictures. If it's a reply or a news, it's got a link to the news. It might say, "What the heck?" question mark, and you wouldn't know
Right.
what it was about unless you saw it was a link to a Brexit article, or Trump tweet, or a reply. Or the thing that makes Twitter great, the genius of Twitter, is the Twitter display. It's the reason we look at Twitter on our phone. It's the reason we look at Twitter on our computers. It's beautiful. It's elegant. It does a lot of stuff. It incorporates, discursive democracy, voting through retweets and likes. It has replies, so engagement. It's a brilliant thing, but it all depends on the Twitter display. So why does Twitter teach academics to study tweets in a spreadsheet? What? If you can answer that question, you're smarter than me.
I don't know why, but I think that, it's, also being interested in qualitative research online, that, there are a lot of researchers who might have data like the exchange that we have here, where it's multimedia.
Right.
There are all kinds of things that you could describe from what you see. We haven't been talking about something particularly emotional, but there's the nonverbal, there's what's in the background of your space, whether you choose to share that or not. There's all kinds of stuff, but often people will simply transcribe
Yep.
to text where you've lost all of that, in which case, from my point of view, it's like, why did you even bother having that kind of visually rich exchange, or collecting that very visually rich data, if you were just going to, translate it into a flat, kind of text and just look at the words.
Right.
The words might mean something very different, separated from the facial expression, the emotion, the nonverbal things like, did you pause because you're trying to collect your emotions, or reflect on something, and all of that is lost. So it kind of doesn't surprise me that would be a way that they might, I don't think.
It sort of flattens the beauty of their
Yes.
data, right? And I think qualitative researchers, as much as anyone else, appreciate that the context matters, the pictures matter, that everything matters, and it's not for the platform to say, the flat text is good enough.
Right. Well, I hope that you will keep me posted as you continue to kind of uncover things about what's going on that might not be visible to the, people who are not insider experts as you are on this topic. Because I think, it is of interest to our community. And, I do think that, you know, while there are people who want to stop and look at the car crash, there are a lot of us who are like, you know, we've got other things to do. We're gonna have to find somewhere else to do it because, you know, we don't want to be looking at a car crash every minute. You know, where is that space? And I mean, to me, there are just so many questions. To me,
I agree.
the development with Elon Musk taking over the platform and immediately firing lots of people who had been in charge and promising to relax what were already very lax standards, as you've described, you know, seems very dangerous to me. And you know, so on one hand, you've got this, you know, kind of frightening prospect of, you know, what's going to spill over next from this kind of mass, you know, hate fest. And then you have the other thing of like, well, where do the rest of us get, you know, the opportunity to have the positive and fruitful exchange that we're looking for? And, you know, do we have to, like I say, you know, shift into some other ways of being? And, you know, hopefully that'll spark some innovation.
There's a classic reading in the history of social science, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, especially the history of business. It's a business reading, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, I think from the 50s. And it basically says consumers have these three choices. You know, they can leave, they can speak up, or they can stay loyal. And this gets problematic in monopoly or close to monopoly situation. Twitter doesn't have a monopoly, but for a certain segment of our population, they do, right? For people who use Twitter in certain ways, they do. So those are the three choices we have: exit, voice, and loyalty. I'm hard pressed to be loyal at this point. Addicted would probably be a better way of describing it. But voice is something that in a democratic society we still have. And I've been actually taking heart in the last just 24 hours with some of the things I've read about the response of advertisers, particularly after the Pelosi tweet, that advertisers said no. And all Twitter is, and the reason we all like Twitter is it's free, right? It's a free app that's paid for by Coca-Cola, Ford, you know, Pepsi, Nike, go down the list, Adidas. And one of the key things that will stop Twitter from cleaning up bots and trolls and some of the people I told you about today is that on every one of those timelines, there's ads. Every single insurrectionist has advertisements on their timeline. And every time there's engagement with the timeline, anybody views it, scrolls it, that's a ka-ching, ka-ching in the ad revenue for Twitter. So my hope is that in the great tradition of democracy, when you go too far, sort of things spring back. And I think things are getting out of hand. Violent insurrections and, you know, people making all their political advertisements and with guns, and just a sort of pro-insurrectionist mentality more generally. I think the advertisers, who may not be our favorite corporations in the world at the best of times, are going to be one of the checks, because he has to find a way to recoup his 44 billion. And the only way is with advertisers. It cannot possibly recoup his money, sustain his platform, rule the world, overthrow democracy, you know, elevate Putin to God status without advertising, because otherwise the whole thing goes down. So my hope is, in the end, you know, there are these 4 regulatory mechanisms out there. You know, East Coast Code, Lawrence Lessig said this in his great book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. East Coast Code, the laws, there's norms, there's West Coast Code, that's the architecture of the internet. And then there's the market. And Lessig said 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, architecture or code would become the master regulator. What the internet allows you to do, what it stops you from doing, what it enables, the code is the master regulator. That East Coast code is going to be powerless versus West Coast. And then norms are going to be weak versus markets. And so we're in a situation where we're looking at 4 possible regulators: government, norms, the market, and code. And I think in the end, it could be the market that saves Twitter, because the architecture right now is set up for information warfare.
All righty, well, lots to think about here, so thank you for
You're welcome.
taking the time to
Thanks for
get a
listening.
little bit deeper explanation about what's going on, and I think there are a lot of decisions people will have to make about how they're going to respond.
One is trust your election officials. They work hard, they don't conspire, and they don't even know each other. So the whole idea of election fraud is a big joke, because you work with strangers every time.
Right. Crazy times, for sure.
Great to meet you though, Janet.
Yes,
And
sure.
I'm glad you're doing the series, and I hope that this was useful for what you're trying to achieve.
Yes, thank you.